All right, today we're going to get into one of nature's most elegant solutions to a really dangerous genetic problem. We're talking about a high-stakes balancing act that's happening right now inside the cells of tons of different species, including us. So let's just dive right in. So, our whole story really kicks off with a simple question, and it all comes from this cat right here. You've probably seen a calico cat before, right? With those really distinct patches of orange and black fur. Well, have you ever noticed, or maybe heard, that they're almost always female? It's true. And the reason why? Well, it's way more than just a fun fact. In fact, when you figure out the calico cat mystery, you're actually unlocking a super fundamental survival trick that evolution itself had to solve. It all boils down to a problem of numbers, a numbers game where getting the math wrong isn't just a mistake, it's catastrophic. And that right there brings us to the core issue, what scientists call the gene dosage problem. Life is all about balance, right? Well, that's especially true for the instructions written on our chromosomes. Think of it like a recipe. Too much of one ingredient or too little, and the whole thing is ruined. In genetics, it can literally be deadly. So what's the solution? Well, it's a process called dosage compensation. And it's basically how life levels the playing field. See, different sexes often have different numbers of sex chromosomes. Dosage compensation makes sure that they both produce the same amount of stuff, proteins, from the genes on those chromosomes. It's not about changing the genes themselves, but about controlling how much they're used. It's like a genetic volume knob. Okay, in mammals, that's us. This is a really obvious problem. Females have two X chromosomes, which means they've got two copies of every single gene on the X. But males, they've got one X and one Y, so they only have one copy. Now, if female cells just let both of those X's run wild, that double dose of gene products would create a massive, totally toxic imbalance. So, how does life solve this pretty fundamental problem? Well, it turns out there's more than one way to do it. All right, so let's start with the first solution, the one that mammals came up with. That includes us and, yep, our calico cat. Evolution's answer here was kind of shockingly simple. Just turn one of them off. So here's what happens. Really early on, when a female embryo is just a tiny ball of cells, each one of those cells makes a completely random choice. It's like flipping a coin. It decides to shut down either the X chromosome it got from its mom or the one it got from its dad. And once that decision is made, it's locked in. Every single cell that comes from that original cell will inherit the same choice. The technical name for this process is X inactivation. The chromosome that gets silenced is packed up so tightly that it becomes this little dense blob inside the cell called a bar body. You can actually see it under a microscope. It's also sometimes called lionization, which is a shout out to the brilliant geneticist Mary Lyon, who is one of the key people to figure all this out. So how on earth does the cell actually do this? It's amazing, really. The whole thing is controlled by two incredible molecules, and they're not even proteins, they're a special kind of RNA. The first one is called X'd. The chromosome that's destined to be shut down starts making this X'd RNA, and it literally paints itself with it. This coding is like a signal that calls in other proteins to lock it down. But wait, what about the other one? Well, the other X chromosome makes a molecule called TSIX. Yep, that's X'd spelled backwards, which acts like a shield protecting it from being silenced. It's this incredible molecular duel that decides the fate of each X chromosome. And this brings us full circle, right back to our calico cat. Here's how it works. The gene for fur color in cats is on the X chromosome. One version of the gene makes orange fur, and another version makes black fur. So in a female calico, some of her cells randomly shut down the X that has the black fur gene. What do you get? A patch of orange fur. In other parts of her body, the cells shut down the X with the orange fur gene. What do you get there? A patch of black fur. The whole cat is a living, breathing mosaic of all these random decisions made when she was just an embryo. That's where the patches come from. Okay, but hold on, because shutting down a whole chromosome is just one way to solve this dosage problem. Nature is way more creative than that. Let's look at fruit flies. They evolved a completely different, you might even say opposite strategy. Instead of turning a chromosome down, they turn one up. Yeah, you heard that right. In fruit flies, the female's two X chromosomes are both fully active. So to keep up, the male's single X chromosome has to work twice as hard. It basically goes into overdrive, doubling the amount of stuff it produces to match the female's output. The scientific term for this is hypertranscription. And the molecular machine that pulls this off has a pretty dramatic name. It's called the male-specific lethal complex, or MSL for short. And that name is no joke. If any part of this machine breaks, it is absolutely lethal, but only for the males. Why? Because without it, they can't boost their X chromosome's activity, and they can't match the female's level. That imbalance is fatal. So let's take a look under the hood of this MSL complex. You've got your MSL proteins, which are like the main building blocks, the scaffolding. Then you've got this really important enzyme called MOF. What it does is add these little chemical tags to the chromosome that kind of loosen it up, making the genes way easier for the cell to read. And guess what's back? Non-coding RNAs. Just like in mammals, here they're called ROX RNAs, and they act like a GPS system, guiding the whole MSL machine to exactly the right spot, the male's X chromosome, so it can crank up the volume.
Okay, so let's recap. We've seen one strategy, turning a chromosome off, and a second strategy, cranking another one way up. But believe it or not, there's a third major strategy out there used by this tiny roundworm called C. elegans. It doesn't do either of those things. It finds a compromise. It meets in the middle. So in these little worms, you have males who have one X chromosome, and you have hermaphrodites who have two X chromosomes. Now, to get everything balanced, the hermaphrodites don't just shut one X off completely. No, instead, they just dial down the activity of both of their X chromosomes by half, by exactly 50%. That way, their total output perfectly matches the male's single X chromosome that's going at full speed. Okay, so how in the world does a worm's cell know it has two X chromosomes and needs to turn them down? It's all managed by this incredibly precise genetic cascade. Think of it like a chain reaction or a line of dominoes falling. It all kicks off with the cell literally counting how many X chromosomes it has. That count is what determines the worm's sex and what happens next. Let's focus on pathway A here, which shows us what happens in the XX hermaphrodite. It's a beautiful system. First, there are these special sensor proteins that can tell there are two X chromosomes present. Once they're activated, their job is to block a master gene, a gene that basically says, become male. So by shutting down the male program, they allow a different gene to turn on. And this new gene is the one that builds the machine we're looking for, the dosage compensation complex. This complex then goes and binds to both X chromosomes and just gently applies the brakes, dialing back their expression by 50%. It's just an amazing, precise system of checks and balances. Okay, so what's the big takeaway from all this? I mean, we've just looked at three totally different, totally independent solutions to the exact same life or death problem. This is just a perfect example of what biologists call convergent evolution, when different species find different paths to the same destination.
And this table really sums it all up beautifully, doesn't it? You've got mammals who solve the problem by silencing one female X chromosome. You've got fruit flies who go the other way and double the male's X. And then you have C. elegans, the roundworms, who just have the activity of both hermaphrodite X's. Three completely different mechanisms, all achieving the exact same essential goal, making sure gene expression between the sexes is balanced.
There's a great quote in the source material that just hits the nail on the head. It says, organisms can't just replicate a gene out of thin air, so instead they have to equalize the expression from each gene. And that's it, right there. You can't just add or delete a whole chromosome whenever you want. The genetic hardware is fixed. So life had to get really, really clever and invent some amazing molecular software to control the output. It's all about managing expression. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? If evolution figured out at least three completely separate, incredibly complex solutions for just this one problem, you have to wonder, what other invisible, perfectly choreographed genetic ballets are going on inside our cells right now, just to make life possible? What else is happening that we don't even know about? Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for digging into this with us.